Hi, I'm Lina. Welcome to Lina's Storybook, where we share the most unforgettable audio novels. Let's get started.
He gave all his love and wealth to his secret mistress and their offspring, but left nothing but hatred, venomous lies, and a shattered family to me. But my passing was not my end. It was the beginning of my reckoning. Before his final moments, my husband Thomas lied to us, claiming there was a heavy box of gold coins hidden within the walls of our home. He spoke with such fragile, desperate conviction that our children believed him implicitly. Our children, driven by a desperate desire for the inheritance, practically dug 3 feet under the floorboards of the old house. They tore up the very foundations of the home we had built, blinded by the promise of wealth. In the end, our children only found suspicion, turning against one another, and completely cutting ties. The family I had held together with my blood, sweat, and tears dissolved into bitter resentment over a phantom fortune. It wasn't until the second year after his passing, during the annual visit to his resting place, that the agonizing truth was finally unveiled to me. The autumn wind was biting, slicing through my thin coat as I stood concealed behind a row of ancient oak trees. I heard a familiar, elegant voice. I listened closely and heard Thomas's lifelong secret love, Evelyn, standing gracefully in front of his memorial alongside a young man who was her grandson, sighing with immense relief and profound gratitude. "Oh Thomas, thankfully you left all your inheritance to me," Evelyn murmured, her tone dripping with a honeyed satisfaction. "Our son has just purchased a luxurious mansion in the city, and our grandson is preparing to study abroad." She laughed, a chilling melodic sound that pierced my heart. "As for Catherine and those wretched children of hers, they've long since broken the family apart trying to find that fictitious box of gold coins. Catherine has aged almost 20 years overnight. Ha ha." She leaned down, her manicured fingers gently tracing the cold stone. "Thomas, you truly were the cleverest of men. Catherine kept us apart in life, so in death, you made sure she and her children would never know a day of peace." After speaking those venomous words, she gently stroked the tombstone. "In this lifetime, I cannot have my name carved next to yours on this stone. But in the next life, we must be together forever." I felt a sharp, sickening tightness in my chest, an unbearable, suffocating agony. My brain buzzed violently, a deafening ringing echoing in my ears as the world spun around me. My husband Thomas and his pristine white moonlight, Evelyn, actually had an illegitimate child together. Thomas had spent his entire life obsessing over his pristine reputation as an honorable, intellectual gentleman. That was exactly why he had kept his scandalous affair with Evelyn perfectly watertight, hiding it so well that I only discovered the devastating truth at his grave after he was already gone. He had given every ounce of his love, and all his worldly wealth to his secret mistress and their descendants. Yet, he intentionally left behind nothing but pure hatred, and a destructive lie for me and our children. Destruction is merely a physical end. But what right did Thomas have to completely obliterate my soul and break my family's spirit? I wandered back to our old ruined house in a complete daze, my mind fractured. Looking at the remnants of a lifetime spent within those walls, I felt an overwhelming sense of sheer, hollow pointlessness. Without a second thought, I typed out a message detailing every sickening thing that had just occurred at the cemetery and sent it individually to each of my children. Don't ask me why I didn't send it to a family group chat. My family had entirely fallen apart the moment Thomas uttered that malicious lie on his deathbed. After completing this final task, a bone-deep exhaustion overtook me. The moment my head touched the pillow, I fell into a deep, unending sleep. When I was suddenly jolted awake, I was greeted by a remarkably familiar scene. White mourning banners swayed gently in the heavy air. People were dressed in traditional black and white mourning attire. The funeral dirge played in sharp, harsh bursts, grating painfully against the ears. It was a funeral hall. However, the portrait sitting on the altar was mine. I figured I must be gone. It seemed my spirit had returned on the 7th day after my passing to take one final, lingering look at the children I worried about so deeply. My eldest son, William, and his wife were high-ranking officials in the government sector. When Thomas passed away, they had strictly insisted on a very modest, quiet funeral to avoid any public scrutiny. Yet now, The scale and grandeur of my funeral were more than double the size of his. My second son, Henry, and his wife were shrewd business people, who usually calculated every penny. But right now, they were weeping uncontrollably. Listening to their fragmented conversations, I finally understood. The moment they received my text message, they rushed frantically back to the old house, only to discover my cold, motionless body. My youngest daughter, Lily, who had long since divorced, was supporting the granddaughter I had raised single-handedly. She stood in the center of the hall, vibrating with absolute fury. There is no greater sorrow than a broken heart. I cannot let our mother leave this world like this. That old man never did a single decent thing in his entire life, and even in death, he orchestrated it so our family would tear itself apart. Henry gritted his teeth, his eyes red. I'm going to the banks to find my contacts. A massive financial transfer like that couldn't possibly happen without leaving a paper trail. Then I'm hiring the best lawyers. We are absolutely getting that inheritance back. His wife, dabbing her tears, whispered cautiously. But what if the transfers were all given as cash gifts? Or if there was some sort of voluntary legal gifting agreement? This lawsuit will be incredibly difficult to win. Henry's expression darkened into something terrifying. If we can't get them through legal, open channels, I will utterly expose them privately. Will, what do you say? William and his wife exchanged a long, meaningful look. His answer was concise and firm. Expose him. Ha. Thomas. Are you watching this? My children ultimately turned out completely different from what you expected. You thought you could use a fabricated fortune to permanently dismantle our family, but you were dreaming. It's a pity though. It was all too late. If only I had known the absolute truth years ago, I would have taken my children and left Thomas far behind. If I had done that, would my children and I have been spared all the terrible hardship we endured in the past? When I opened my eyes again, I slowly woke up lying on a firm, familiar mattress. My head was spinning violently. My throat was parched, my stomach cramped with intense hunger, and my entire body felt completely drained of energy. Several small trembling voices were crying out to me, like frightened kittens. Mom, boo-hoo. Mom, please wake up. I forced my heavy eyelids open. Above me I saw the tear-stained faces of 3 young children, restored to their pint-sized childhood selves. Will, Henry, Lily? I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. Seeing that I was awake, William, my eldest, let out a massive sigh of relief. Mom, you've been unconscious for a whole day and a night, and Dad hasn't come back. Mom, does Dad not want us anymore? I reached up and rubbed my forehead, wincing as my fingers brushed against a swollen, throbbing lump. My mind was a blur. I couldn't remember exactly what had happened right before I blacked out. The 2 younger children, Henry and Lily, were just crying loudly and helplessly. William, however, was articulate enough to explain the situation. Between heavy sobs and wiping his runny nose, he recounted the terrifying events that occurred before I lost consciousness. It had happened the previous evening. Thomas had returned to the house, his temperament drastically and violently changed. He began frantically rummaging through our cabinets and drawers, shoving our bank passbooks and all our essential ration coupons into his pockets, fully intending to leave. I had just returned home and caught him in the act. Naturally, I fiercely refused to let him take our survival funds. A fierce argument erupted between us. During the fight, Thomas spat out increasingly bizarre and inexplicable words. He screamed that I had ruined his entire life and delayed his true destiny. He claimed that heaven had blessed him with a chance to start over, and he absolutely refused to miss his opportunity this time. When it came to the children, he coldly told me that I could figure out what to do with them myself. The children had rushed over, desperately trying to break up the fight. In the chaotic struggle, Thomas, finding the crying children to be a nuisance, roughly shoved 5-year-old Henry and 3-year-old Lily out of his way. My heart broke, and I rushed forward to protect them, but Thomas shoved me violently. My head slammed viciously against the solid oak doorframe, seeing me completely knocked out cold. Thomas didn't even attempt to help or administer first aid. Instead, he scooped up every valuable item in the house and bolted out the door. William had tried to care for his younger brother and sister, but his small hands couldn't stop his own father from escaping. over the course of the last day and night. William and the two toddlers had somehow managed to drag and push my limp body onto the bed. They had sat vigil by my bedside, begging God to let me wake up soon. Listening to his recount, I furrowed my brows deeply throughout his life. Thomas had always cared obsessively about his public image. When had he ever caused such a chaotic, violent scene? Unless he, just like me, had retained the memories of his past life, and, after passing away, inexplicably found himself transported back to the 1970s. At this moment, 7-year-old William stood by the bed, merely whimpering, "Mom, Dad really abandoned us." Henry was 5. Lily was even younger, barely 3 years old. I grabbed the two younger ones, one in each hand, pulling them close. I shot William a stern look, effectively silencing his cries. Suddenly, Lily's tiny stomach let out a loud, rumbling growl. "Mom, I'm hungry," she whimpered. My poor pitiful children had been starving for a full day and a night. Ignoring my dizziness, I forced myself up, lit the stove, and quickly cooked 3 bowls of simple vegetable oatmeal. The two younger kids devoured their food, eating loudly and aggressively, but William was so consumed by grief that he couldn't stomach a single bite. "Mom, if I had just held on to Dad's leg tighter, would he have stayed with us?" William asked, his voice cracking. My head was pounding relentlessly. "The legs belong to your father. Even if he couldn't run away today, do you think he wouldn't just run away tomorrow?" I scolded him gently but firmly. William swallowed hard. "But," I pushed back, "your dad has been gone for a whole day and night. If I hadn't woken up, were you 3 planning to just struggle on your own or cry yourselves to sleep? Why didn't you know to go outside and scream for help?" William's mouth turned down as he cried. "But Dad always said that family shames must never be aired in public." Hearing that toxic brainwashing, I was so furious I almost passed out again. In my previous life, Thomas's family had been wealthy landowners. Before the economic reforms, his family basically owned half of the county. His white moonlight Evelyn came from an even more prominent background. Her family had deep ties to politics, and she even had an uncle who was a high-ranking official who had fled overseas during a massive scandal. Back in those days, because their family backgrounds were considered heavily problematic by the new social order, both of them faced constant rejections and dead ends in their work and daily lives. In order to secure a better chance at survival, Thomas was forced to break up with Evelyn and marry me, the daughter of a destitute, working-class farming family. After we married, Thomas constantly looked down on me. He felt I was ignorant, petty, and that my behavior and speech were entirely unpresentable for high society. My family was indeed poor. However, I was educated and had finished middle school. Desperate not to be continuously despised, I studied fiercely and managed to earn a vocational college degree. Yet, Thomas always loved to spout nonsense, claiming that even the women in his aristocratic family who lacked formal diplomas possessed an innate brilliance and refinement that would utterly crush me. I knew that arguing with Thomas over intellect and education was a losing battle, so I poured all my energy into working hard and managing our daily lives. Throughout our marriage, we raised 3 children. Our days were seemingly calm, filled with a quiet sort of peace. Yet, Thomas constantly complained over nothing, quoting poetry to claim that even though we lived a respectful life together, his heart would forever remain deeply unsatisfied and full of regrets. With my practical, grounded education, I genuinely couldn't comprehend what he was whining about all day long. Honestly, I too wanted to live a life as beautiful as poetry. However, the crushing burdens of daily survival, the endless labor of farm work and chores, and the immense pressure of raising 3 children took everything I had. The first thing I faced when I opened my eyes every morning was the harsh reality of earning our bread and butter. How could I possibly have the luxury of studying classical literature and romantic poetry? But I always felt a lingering guilt, believing that it was the difficult era that had trapped Thomas's brilliant spirit and talent, leaving him deeply depressed and unfulfilled for most of his life. Invisibly, the children and I became conditioned to prioritize his intellectual desires above all else. and our entire household silently and obediently followed whatever Thomas dictated. But looking back now, wasn't it simply that the whole family had grown so accustomed to being mentally suppressed by Thomas that we blindly followed his every command? Otherwise, how could a simple phrase, like family shames, must never be aired in public, completely terrify my eldest son into not seeking help when his mother was bleeding and unconscious? I slammed my hand down on the wooden table in blinding anger. What do you mean? Family shames must never be aired, I shouted. Air it. I am going to air his dirty laundry so loudly that he becomes famously notorious. I will make sure every single household knows his name. I looked down at the 3 weak pitiful children, sitting silently around the table, terrified to even breathe heavily. God must have heard my agonizing pleas in the funeral hall, and sent me back to this exact moment. He sent me back so I could personally rescue myself and my children from the burning hellfire of Thomas's manipulation. The next morning, the frost on the grass was thick, as I took Henry and Lily next door to ask our neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, to watch them. Mrs. Higgins leaned in, speaking in a hushed, secretive tone. Actually, the day before yesterday, I heard a terrible fight coming from your house, and the kids were screaming. But when I knocked on your door, Little Will just cracked it open a sliver, and told me you were just sleeping, and that his brother and sister were perfectly fine. Catherine, are you and Thomas really okay? She asked with genuine concern. As she said this, William was standing right beside me. His head hung low in intense shame. Suddenly, I remembered one of the strict rules in our household. Thomas's family had been wealthy landlords. Because of that background, his family had always kept strictly to themselves in the village. Even with their closest relatives and friends, they refused to interact much. After I married Thomas, our household was forced to strictly follow his family's paranoid rules. Even if visitors came during the broad daylight, they were absolutely forbidden from entering the house. We were only allowed to speak to them through a crack in the door, and once finished, the door had to be immediately locked tight. Having lived through 2 lifetimes, a sudden, blinding realization hit me. What kind of narrow, suffocating, and isolated environment had Thomas forced me and my children to live in all these years? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Without holding anything back, I spilled the entire truth to Mrs. Higgins. How Thomas had stolen all our cash and ration coupons, and how he had violently mistreated me and the children. Mrs. Higgins was absolutely stunned. Has Thomas lost his mind? He always acts so polite and refined. How could he do something so vicious? I lifted Henry and Lily's small shirts, exposing the dark, ugly bruises on their little stomachs. The 2 toddlers winced in discomfort, tears welling in their eyes, but they stubbornly held back their cries. Seeing the injuries, Mrs. Higgins immediately started criticizing Thomas's name. William, however, kept his head lowered, blaming himself. Mom, it is all my fault. I didn't protect my younger brother and sister well enough. Swallowing my rising anger, I said firmly. Were you the one who hurt them? Why do you insist on taking the blame for someone else's actions? If you truly want to protect your siblings, what should you do from now on? William remained silent. Henry snorted bravely. If anyone hurts me, I'm going to stand up to them right back. Lily chimed in with her sweet, babyish voice. Daddy bad, hurt. I pulled the 2 youngest ones into my arms. Whoever took a heavy blow to the stomach is the only one who truly knows the pain. Will, didn't you want to find your father? I asked. I am going to take you to the city to find him right now. William's eyes instantly sparkled, filling with desperate hope. He still viewed Thomas through the idealized lens of a deeply knowledgeable, respectable father. I knew that unless he saw the brutal truth with his own 2 eyes, he would never be able to shatter that childish fantasy. Mrs. Higgins pulled Henry and Lily into her own arms, speaking with fierce loyalty. Catherine, you absolutely cannot let him get away with this. At the very least, you have to get your money back. I'll watch the 2 little ones for you. If Thomas dares to come back to the village early, I'll have my husband block his path. I thanked her deeply. Holding William's trembling hand, we walked to the main road to catch the bus heading straight into the city. As we waited, William's deep-seated anxiety flared up again. Mom, Since everyone knows what Dad did, will they all look down on us from now on? I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with unwavering certainty. We are not the ones who committed a crime, and we will absolutely not be the ones losing face. Seeing that William still looked deeply troubled, I continued. When a child does something wrong, they have to be corrected. Your father is a grown adult, an intellectual who claims to know so much about morality and right and wrong. Don't you think he deserves an even harsher lesson? William's expression shifted, becoming intensely thoughtful. After arriving in the bustling city, I led William through the unfamiliar streets until we finally located the faculty housing compound of a prestigious local prep school. Peering carefully through the white picket fence that enclosed a private ground-floor courtyard, a picturesque scene unfolded before our eyes. There stood Thomas, looking remarkably refreshed, youthful, and energetic, standing shoulder to shoulder with a breathtakingly beautiful woman in an elegant dress. Beside them was a young boy, about 6 or 7 years old. They were gathered around a pristine white garden table, happily enjoying a warm afternoon tea with delicate pastries in a perfect display of domestic bliss. The little boy laughed at something Thomas said and turned his face toward the sunlight. My breath hitched violently in my throat. It was a face that bore a striking 70 to 80% resemblance to my eldest son, William, who was standing right beside me. This child was the illegitimate son of Thomas and his pristine white moonlight, Evelyn. The veins in my forehead throbbed with a burning rage. William was entirely paralyzed by shock and bewilderment. His tiny hands curling into tight fists, he clamped his hands desperately over his own mouth, suppressing the agonizing sobs that threatened to tear from his throat. We watched in agonizing silence for a few more moments before the little boy gleefully ran back inside the house. Left alone in the garden, Thomas's eyes were filled with a deep, lingering romantic affection. Evelyn smiled radiantly, her words sweet and gentle. The two of them draped their arms around each other's shoulders, looking exactly like a deeply devoted, inseparable married couple. "Why did you come here so suddenly?" Evelyn asked, her voice carrying over the fence. "And you bought so many expensive things, even that upright piano. When the old man gets back, how on earth am I supposed to explain all of this to him?" Thomas replied with solemn, unwavering devotion. "Explain what? Tommy is my son. I am never going back to that house in the countryside. Don't you worry, I've been given a second chance at life, and for the next few decades, I am perfectly willing to give you and Tommy the best life imaginable." After exchanging those grand promises, the two of them walked arm in arm into the house. A few moments later, the melodious, elegant sound of piano music drifted out from the open windows, accompanied by the joyful, echoing laughter of their perfect family of 3. When Thomas was a younger man, he constantly claimed that he donated a full 2/3 of his meager salary to help financially struggling colleagues and poor, desperate students seeking an education, earning himself a stellar reputation as a charitable, compassionate saint. Meanwhile, every single expense in our rural household was covered entirely by the wages from my grueling farm labor, along with the pitiful remaining 1/3 of his salary, forcing our entire family to live in extreme, penny-pinching poverty. How could I have ever known the truth back then? Thomas had secretly given all his money to his mistress in the city, fully funding a luxurious life for her and their illegitimate son. "Mom, why is Dad with them? Who on earth are they?" William asked, his voice trembling violently as he tugged frantically at my hand. His agonizing question snapped me back to reality, my palms slick with a cold sweat. She is the woman your father truly loves. And that boy is the child your father had with her." The very moment I spoke that devastating truth aloud, the expression on my 7-year-old son's face shattered completely, as if his entire universe had just collapsed in on itself. The idealized image of Thomas as an educated, responsible father was permanently destroyed in his eldest son's heart. The realization hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't that his father had simply abandoned him in a moment of madness. It was that his father had never, not even for a second, truly cared for his existence. Tears streaming uncontrollably down my face, I gripped William's hand tightly and marched away from the faculty housing compound. Naturally, Our distress caught the attention of several residents in the affluent neighborhood. A kind-hearted neighbor carrying a basket of fresh groceries stepped into our path and stopped us. "Are you looking for someone? Or have you run into some terrible trouble? Why are you both crying like this?" she asked with genuine concern. William, utterly broken, completely forgot his father's rule that family shames must never be aired in public. "Ma'am, my dad doesn't want us anymore," he cried out. I immediately feigned a look of intense embarrassment, heavily mixed with agonizing despair, and spilled my story. "My husband is a reckless monster. He took every cent of our savings and our bonds, telling me not to delay his true destiny, and that I could figure out what to do with the kids myself. Then he ran off to the city to be with another woman. People from our village told me they saw him come here. So my son and I chased after him, only to discover he had a child with another woman years ago," I sobbed. As I spoke, several other neighbors, their ears perked up for news, slowly gathered around us. The lady with the groceries looked absolutely scandalized, a literal wave of shock washing over her features. She couldn't help but stare intently at William's tear-stained, youthful face. Oh my goodness, the resemblance. He looks far too much like him," she gasped. The other residents who had crowded around exchanged wide-eyed, knowing glances, putting the puzzle pieces together. Seeing the seed planted, I yanked William's hand, pretending I was ready to storm off. The lady couldn't hold back and asked urgently, "Honey, where are you going now?" I puffed out my chest and declared righteously, "I'm going to the school board to report him. His child with that woman is almost the exact same age as my eldest son here. He hid this from me for all these years, keeping one family in the city and another in the country. Does he think he is entitled to multiple lives?" The lady and the surrounding neighbors gasped, sudden comprehension dawning on their faces. They immediately stepped back, refusing to block our path any longer. I knew exactly what was about to happen, the very second we walked out of the gates of that faculty housing compound. The neighborhood news would transform into a ravenous wave, completely dismantling Thomas, Evelyn, and that illegitimate child, until absolutely nothing remained of their pristine reputations, because Evelyn already had a husband, the highly respected, retired old headmaster Arthur of that very school. In my previous life, I had always known of Evelyn's existence. It wasn't just because she was famous in the neighboring towns for her stunning beauty. It was mostly because, back in the early 1980s, she committed an act so shocking it rattled the entire community. During the 80s economic boom, there was a massive wave of rural workers migrating to the cities to find better opportunities. Evelyn, a girl from a poor farming village, used a connection to get a job in the city working as a live-in helper for an elderly, retired teaching couple. As she continued to work there, the elderly wife unexpectedly passed away from a sudden medical complication. Just a few short months after his first wife's tragic passing, the old headmaster marched down to the courthouse and legally married his young helper, Evelyn. The old man's adult children, who lived out of state, were absolutely disgusted by the betrayal. They immediately returned home and completely severed all ties with their father. But the old headmaster braved the intense public outcry, perfectly willing to spend his twilight years with his young bride. Less than 6 months after their hasty wedding, Evelyn gave birth to a healthy baby boy in the city hospital. The entire situation caused an absolute uproar back then. Even in my isolated rural village, I heard countless people whispering about it, treating it as an unbelievable piece of news. I went home and recounted the story to Thomas. His face instantly darkened with anger, and he aggressively pointed his finger at me. "It is bad enough that you listen to baseless rumors and spread unverified stories behind people's backs," Thomas had shouted. He used the opportunity to humiliate me, severely damaging my standing in front of our children. But what was the actual sickening truth? Evelyn and Thomas had been having a passionate affair long before that. Evelyn had callously deceived the old headmaster, driving away his entire family so she could use his wealth and status to help her raise Thomas's secret son. Thomas had the absolute audacity to commit such a despicable act but completely lacked the courage to own up to it, fiercely forbidding me from speaking ill of his precious beloved. They were truly a perfectly matched pair of manipulative individuals. Fortunately, I had relatives in the city I could rely on. My cousin, George. In the early 1980s, the winds of economic reform had swept through our region. Cousin George had moved to the city to try his hand at business. And within a few short years, he had struck gold. He brought his wife and children to the city to enjoy a lavish, comfortable life, opening a highly successful diner. Everyone in our home village was green with envy. When I had casually mentioned his success at home, Thomas had sneered in absolute disgust. He is nothing but new money, wearing thick chains and massive watches. He reeks of vulgar consumerism. Why on earth would you envy that? Intimidated, I had never brought up this side of my family again. But now, as William and I stood crying in front of Cousin George's bustling restaurant, everything changed. George was initially stunned to see us, but as soon as he noticed the tear streaks on our faces, he rushed forward with deep concern. "Catherine, what happened? Who bothered you two?" he demanded. I quickly and tearfully explained the entire ordeal. Martha, George's fiery wife, who had initially looked a bit impatient at our unannounced arrival, completely lost her temper. She planted her hands on her hips, stomped her foot on the diner floor, and started criticizing Thomas loudly. "How much money does Thomas even make a month? And he secretly set up a whole second household in the city. He even bought them a piano," Martha shouted, her voice echoing over the clatter of the diner. "No wonder he took every last cent of your savings. It was all to fund that woman and her child. Catherine, what kind of hardship have you and those 3 children been living in out there in the countryside?" Her furious rant hit the nail right on the head. William's face grew even paler, a look of profound distress washing over him. Thomas had always claimed to value William the most. He always preached that, as the eldest son, William had to bear the heavy responsibilities of the family, that he needed to study relentlessly to uphold the prestigious academic legacy of the Thomas family line. But what was the reality? Thomas's hidden son lived in a spacious sunlit house with a beautiful private garden. He had an expensive piano in the living room, and played beautiful melodies whenever he pleased. He ate sweet pastries with his afternoon tea. And William? He was forced to share a cramped, creaky wooden bed with his little brother, playing in the dirt because they had nothing else. He had to study until late at night, scoring perfect marks on his exams just to earn a single cheap piece of shortbread. As a reward, the difference in how they were treated was like night and day. William broke down, letting out a tearful sob. "Mom, did Dad never care for me at all? Did he only pretend to like me because I look like that other boy?" The heartbreaking question choked me up completely. George and Martha stood in stunned silence, unable to offer any comfort, even if a child's imagination was running wild. Digging deep into that logic, it was entirely, sickeningly plausible. My face darkened like a thundercloud as I firmly pulled William to his feet. "Don't you cry anymore. It is not your father who abandoned us. It is we who are walking away from him." The next morning, I made the decision to leave William safely in Martha's care at the diner. I gathered Cousin George and a few of his burly kitchen staff, and we marched directly toward the upscale faculty housing compound. When we reached the property, it was the little boy Tommy who opened the front door. In his crisp, childish voice, he looked up at the group of men and asked, "Who are you looking for?" George sneered, his voice rough and direct. "We're looking for your father." Tommy tilted his head, seemingly genuinely confused, and uttered a sentence that defied belief. "Are you looking for my old daddy, or my young daddy?" I let out a harsh, cold laugh. "Just how many daddies do you have? Or better yet, which daddy do you actually prefer?" Tommy smiled, radiating innocent charm. "I like my young daddy." "Tommy, who on earth are you talking to?" Evelyn's gentle voice called out, suddenly laced with sharp suspicion. The little boy, completely shielded from the harsh realities of the world, pushed the front door wide open. I immediately locked eyes with Evelyn, who looked impeccably groomed, her skin glowing and her hair perfectly styled. She, in turn, stared back at me, taking in my weathered appearance, hardened by years of endless farm labor. Standing beside her, little Tommy uttered a phrase that was absolutely devastating in its innocence. "So, Which of my daddies did you guys say you were looking for again? Evelyn looked like she had just seen a ghost. Panic washed over her features, and she lunged forward, scooping the boy into her arms as if to shield him. Evelyn, Tommy. What are you doing at the door? And there he was. Thomas strolled into the hallway, looking perfectly at ease, completely unaware of the confrontation waiting on his porch. There was no need for any more talking. George surged forward, grabbed Thomas by his crisp collar, and pulled him straight out the door and onto the front lawn with a firm throw. George's kitchen crew entered the decorated front garden, grabbing the expensive flower pots and breaking every single one of them onto the ground. Evelyn clutched Tommy tightly to her chest, trembling violently like a leaf in a storm. Without a second of hesitation, I stepped forward and struck her firmly across the cheek. Evelyn was too paralyzed by shock to dodge. The sharp sound echoed across the porch as her cheek instantly reddened. Tommy let out a piercing, terrified scream. "You are bad people. Why are you hurting my mommy and daddy?" I stared down at his youthful face, tracing the undeniable similarities it shared with my eldest son. Evelyn shielded Tommy desperately, suddenly finding a burst of reckless courage. "You've confronted us, smashed our things, and vented your anger. Now take your friends and get out of here. If I call the authorities, none of you will escape consequences." I raised my hand and delivered another firm strike, this time to the other side of her face. "Where is my family's money? Where are our savings bonds?" I yelled. "You married your way into the city, using an old man to help you raise your secret child. And you still have the audacity to take Thomas's money." For years, Thomas claimed he was donating his teaching salary to help struggling colleagues and impoverished students. Now that I've caught you both red-handed, do you dare look me in the eye and say he hasn't spent a single dime on you and this child? Over on the lawn, George had confronted Thomas relentlessly. One of Thomas's front teeth had been knocked loose. Half of his face was grotesquely swollen, causing him to lisp as he gasped for air. How did you find us here?" he wheezed. George delivered 2 more harsh kicks toward him. "You scoundrel. You took every last cent of your family's savings to fund another woman. And you have the nerve to ask how we tracked you down." George then turned his furious gaze on Evelyn, shouting, "Where is the money? Give back the money." Outside the wrought iron gates, a crowd of neighbors had already been listening. Hearing the explosive confrontation, they abandoned all pretense of hiding and began loudly discussing the situation. I wondered why she was so incredibly bold. So this woman brought her secret partner here, and not only are they together, but she is using him for his money too. The old headmaster truly brought this upon himself. Unbelievable, marrying the young helper in his twilight years. The first Mrs. Arthur lived under the exact same roof as these two. Who knows how she really passed away? I intentionally allowed a look of mocking contempt to wash over my face. Evelyn's secret was now public knowledge, exposed for the entire neighborhood to see. Driven mad by the humiliation and the harsh whispers of her wealthy neighbors, Evelyn stood up in a blind, desperate rage. Reaching behind her, she grabbed a heavy clay flower pot and, moving with terrifying speed, swung it violently toward my head. Blood, mixing with the dark, damp potting soil, immediately began to flow down my face. My vision blurred and my body tipped backward. George lunged forward and barely managed to catch me before I hit the pavement. Even Thomas, battered on the grass, couldn't help but shout out in shock, "Evelyn, have you lost your mind?" That shout finally brought Evelyn back to reality. She suddenly realized that dozens of eyes had just watched her commit a violent act, including the eyes of her own child. Tommy's lips trembled violently. "Mommy!" Evelyn grabbed the boy, instinctively trying to retreat into the safety of the house. But George's staff immediately blocked the doorway. Desperate, Evelyn scooped Tommy up and turned, intending to make a dash for the front gate. Instead, she came to a sudden halt. Standing perfectly still in the gateway was a tall, distinguished elderly man, gripping a bulging leather travel bag. Old Headmaster Arthur stood there, his face frozen in absolute horrifying disbelief. Tommy burst into tears and ran toward the old man. "Old Daddy, hurry, You have to help mommy and my young daddy. Arthur's face instantly flushed a dangerous, violent shade of red, and his entire body began to shake uncontrollably. If a few concerned neighbors hadn't rushed forward to support him, the old man likely would have collapsed right there on the walkway. Tommy continued to cry. Old daddy, one of the neighbors, thoroughly disgusted, pushed the little boy away. Get away from him. Tommy fell back onto his rear end, sobbing continuously. Natural consequences. In the 1980s, a scandal involving an unfaithful husband being confronted by his wronged wife and her family completely captured the public's sympathy and outrage. Because my head had been severely injured, George and his crew weren't viewed as the aggressors at all. Instead, they became my defenders and crucial witnesses. At the local police precinct, George emphasized the suffering my children and I had endured back in the countryside, highlighting our miseries. Officers, you didn't see the sheer cruelty of it. Even with several grown men standing right there, my poor cousin was hit over the head so hard she passed out. Just imagine how arrogantly this pair must act when nobody is watching. Meanwhile, Thomas, the completely ruined, unfaithful man, sat in a holding cell. His face was swollen and bruised, and he frantically held his head in absolute despair. His pristine image, his honorable reputation, his teaching career, and the entire future he had meticulously planned. Ruined, completely, and utterly destroyed. When the police officers finally came to process him and transfer him to a permanent cell, a sudden frantic panic overtook him. I need to see my wife, he begged. George, who was giving his statement nearby, looked ready to confront him all over again. You have the nerve to say Catherine's name. When you took all her money and abandoned your family, didn't you mistreat her? She was unconscious on the floor of that farmhouse for an entire day and night, and now your companion just caused her a severe head injury. It is a miracle if she recovers in the hospital. If her condition worsens, both of you are facing extreme criminal charges. Thomas looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His legs instantly gave out, and he collapsed, crawling to his knees in front of George, weeping pitifully. George couldn't hold back his disgust. He pulled his leg back and delivered a firm kick straight to Thomas's chest. Now that she is in critical condition, you finally know how to get on your knees. Get away from me. The police officers only made a minimal effort to pull them apart, giving George enough time to vent his frustration on the despicable man. I spent the next several days in a private hospital room, thoroughly feigning a comatose state. William had learned from George that I was injured into this state by Thomas and Evelyn. The young boy was consumed by a mixture of profound fear and absolute resentment. I just want my mom to wake up, Mom. Please don't leave me behind. He would cry softly. While I pretended to be unconscious, William would carefully wipe my face and hands with a warm washcloth. He pulled a small stool right up to my bedside and read me stories for hours on end. Hearing his small trembling voice, I almost couldn't maintain the act. But I knew I had to push through. I had to keep pretending because, in my previous life, Thomas's influence over William had been absolute and overwhelming. Thomas was the one who taught him how to read and write, constantly filling his head with grand tales of their family history. Among the rough, uneducated farmers in our village, Thomas carried an innate aura of a fallen nobleman's arrogance. In those impoverished times, people lacked exposure. Naturally, they were easily captivated by the sophisticated concepts Thomas introduced, and deeply moved by his eloquent descriptions. In his previous life, William had always held a deep reverence for his father. Thomas dictated which university William attended, what major he studied, and even what kind of woman he was allowed to marry. At every major crossroads in William's life, it was his father's insights that paved his way. I was terrified that if I simply divorced Thomas without letting the children experience the full gravity of his betrayal, the passage of time might cause William to eventually forgive him. I was a woman who had already passed away once. I absolutely could not afford to gamble with this second chance at life. After making William experience a few grueling days of what it felt like to be a motherless child, I finally woke up from my state. Cousin George and his wife Martha hurried to the hospital upon hearing the news, bringing William with them. William threw his arms around me, his face streaked with tears of overwhelming relief. I held him just as tightly. No matter how much the world changed, how could I ever stop loving my own flesh and blood? While the doctor was examining me, I overheard George and Martha whispering in the hallway. I learned that Thomas and Evelyn were already sitting behind bars, facing serious charges of aggravated assault and fraud. Since it was blatantly obvious the child was Thomas's, the utterly humiliated old headmaster Arthur initially refused to care for the boy. However, hearing little Tommy cry "Old Daddy" by his hospital bedside, Arthur relented slightly and allowed the boy to stay. Hiring a nurse to look after him, George sneered at the old man's foolishness, while Martha coldly remarked that the old headmaster and the young companion were clearly cut from the same cloth. I suddenly remembered my encounter with Evelyn in my past life at the cemetery. As an elderly woman, I had been dressed in worn clothing, my face heavily lined with grief. Evelyn, on the other hand, had been draped in designer brands, radiating arrogant elegance from head to toe. She and her child had spent their entire lives living in luxury, not only squandering the old headmaster's estate, but also the wealth she and Thomas had taken from me. Now that I was reborn, was I supposed to just let that child grow up comfortably and wait for him to cause trouble for my children? Absolutely not. I packed up a photograph of Thomas with William, a photograph of Tommy, and a detailed letter, mailing them all anonymously to Headmaster Arthur's adult children in another state. A few days later, while William and I were walking the hospital grounds, we heard a loud argument erupting from an open window on the second floor. It was Arthur's middle-aged daughter, shouting at the fragile old man. "How exactly did my mother pass away?" she yelled. "Didn't you and that young helper conspire together? I thought you were just a foolish old man. But you're actually a cold-hearted person. You let your wife pass away under suspicious circumstances, yet you have the heart to raise another man's child?" Following her shouts came the sound of breaking glass and a child's panicked crying. William squeezed my hand tightly. "Mom, don't be scared. I'm right here." I patted his head. "I'm not scared." I had nothing left to fear. From this moment on, the only people who would suffer were Thomas and his miserable, deceitful new circle. The headmaster's children took Tommy out of the hospital. The spoiled boy threw a massive tantrum, screaming that his old daddy would punish them, only to receive a stern reprimand from Arthur's eldest daughter, calling him an ungrateful child. For self-preservation, the old headmaster merely closed his eyes and looked away. Afterward, his children sent the boy back to Evelyn's rural destitute family. With the assault charges, Thomas and Evelyn were looking at serious legal consequences. Arthur's children, upon learning that their father had secretly sent funds to support Evelyn, were so enraged that they filed a report to reopen the investigation into their mother's sudden passing, while simultaneously suing Evelyn for taking their family's estate. The ensuing scandal was monumental, although the authorities ultimately ruled the first wife's passing a medical complication. The investigation publicly revealed that while his wife was extremely ill, Arthur was busy having an illicit relationship with Evelyn in the quarters, thereby missing the crucial window to get his wife help. Unable to bear the profound public disgrace and the disgust of everyone around him, the old headmaster climbed to the roof of the hospital one dark night and took an irreversible step, passing away on impact. His children quickly arranged his resting place, then hired local individuals to pay a visit to Evelyn's family farm. Evelyn's mother had arrogantly used the taken funds to build a massive farmhouse in her village, sneering at Arthur's children and demanding they treat her with respect. When the family went out for the day, the hired individuals completely dismantled the new house, breaking through the main walls and leaving the structure in absolute unlivable ruins. While Arthur's children were carrying out their justice, I officially divorced Thomas while he sat in his cell. Thomas desperately wanted to see me, obsessed with understanding why his grand second chance at life had immediately collapsed into a nightmare. He had been in such a rush to reclaim his former status, taking my money and moving right into the headmaster's house, assuming he could have everything he wanted. But I knew his greatest anxiety wasn't about me. It was about the small, heavy iron box of gold coins hidden inside the brickwork of our garden shed back home. Thomas had always claimed to be too refined for manual labor, yet he had meticulously built that brick shed and insisted on feeding the animals daily, using it as an excuse to retrieve food for William. I used to think he at least cared for the kids. But even his affection was laced with deceit and hidden motives. Thankfully, this time, I had ensured he faced justice, and I was going to take that box of gold and live a brilliant life with my children. One afternoon, I opened my front door to find Evelyn's furious mother dragging a filthy Tommy onto my porch. "Tommy is Thomas's child. You are his wife, so you have to raise this boy," she demanded, attempting to shove the child at me before fleeing. I grabbed her by the collar. "Are you out of your mind in broad daylight? Why don't you claim I'm your mother and demand I raise you too?" My neighbor Mrs. Higgins heard the noise and immediately rallied the village. Within seconds, a crowd of local women surrounded us, fiercely mocking Evelyn's mother for her daughter's scandalous actions and her shameless audacity to dump the child on my doorstep. Evelyn's mother shouted back, claiming that under old customs, a man's secret child should be raised by his official wife. I spoke right back, reminding her that it wasn't the old times anymore, and criticized her for letting her daughter engage with her employer. Just then, William stepped out, holding up my brand new divorce certificate for everyone to see. "You wicked person, don't you dare bully my mother. It is not that our dad didn't want us. It is that my mom and I threw him away." I used the opportunity to deliver a heartfelt speech to the villagers, exposing how Thomas had secretly funneled all his money to his companion in the city while we struggled, and how his criminal actions had disgraced our entire community. The village women instantly rallied behind me, driving Evelyn's mother and a crying Tommy off my property, as a sudden crack of thunder echoed overhead. Using this harassment as justification, I secured the necessary permits to officially move my family to the city, changing all 3 of my children's last names to my maiden name: Miller, William, Henry, and Lily Miller. I only wanted them to be happy and healthy. Before we left, Mrs. Higgins brought me some news. Desperate to get rid of the burden, Evelyn's mother had tried to illegally send Tommy away through illicit networks. But the boy woke up mid-journey and struggled so violently that both of them tumbled down a steep, rocky ravine. The old woman passed away in the fall, and Tommy suffered severe fractures in both legs, leaving him permanently disabled. "It's their own karma," Mrs. Higgins sighed. I agreed, knowing my children and I were finally heading toward our well-deserved, beautiful future. Decades passed after we moved to the city. William grew up to become a genius, world-renowned artist. Henry, never one for academics, started bussing tables at Cousin George's diner as a teenager, following a tragic accident that took the life of George's only son. A devastated George formally took Henry under his wing, treating him as his heir and business pro-too. With Henry's sharp business sense and George's backing, the diner expanded into a massive national restaurant group. My youngest, Lily, graduated with honors from a prestigious law school. Eventually, our entire family relocated to a sprawling, luxurious coastal estate in the south. One afternoon, our tough nanny, Mrs. Vance, escorted a grubby old plumber through the living room to fix a pipe. As he passed through the grand hall, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Catherine," he rasped. I looked up. The man in the filthy uniform was emaciated and hardened by decades of brutal manual labor, his eyes burning with intense hatred. It was Thomas. He looked around at the opulent mansion, his face twisting in rage. "You ruined my life. I rotted in prison. And you took my family's box of gold coins. Where is it?" Before he could lunge at me, Mrs. Vance tackled him to the hardwood floor with a professional submission hold, making him cry out in discomfort as she pinned him down. I calmly dialed the police. Right at that moment, my 3 highly successful adult children walked through the front doors for our weekly family dinner. William, looking incredibly distinguished, immediately rushed to my side. "Mom, what is going on here?" Thomas's eyes lit up with desperate hope. In his past life, William, as a prominent figure, was his greatest pride and joy. "Will, look at me. I'm your father." William stared at him with absolute freezing indifference. "I don't recall having a father." "Henry, wearing a tailored Italian suit, and Lily, in sharp legal attire, stepped forward. "Well, look at this shameless old beggar trying to claim us," Henry mocked. Thomas glared at him. "If I had known how you'd turn out, I would have abandoned you at birth, you little..." Before he could finish, Henry delivered a sharp slap across Thomas's face. "I'll confront you thoroughly, you scoundrel. I am Henry Miller, CEO of the Miller Restaurant Group. The woman sitting there is my mother, the founding shareholder. You don't know a single thing yet. You dare walk into my house." Lily adjusted her glasses and warned Henry calmly. "Don't hit him, Henry. If you leave a mark, it makes my job as a lawyer harder when I sue him for trespassing and attempted assault. Trust me, I'll make sure every charge sticks." Thomas was completely shattered. He couldn't comprehend how his once obedient children had transformed into these powerful, untouchable figures. "I'm your father, Catherine. You ruined the Thomas legacy. You were supposed to make William a leader to restore our family glory." William cut him off, his voice dripping with icy contempt. "You are the one who ruined everything. Years ago, outside that garden in the city, I heard exactly what you planned to do. You were going to abandon us for your companion and your secret child. You have absolutely no right to step foot in this house." When the police dragged Thomas away, his eyes were locked onto me, completely broken. He wanted to know why his second chance at life had failed, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of an answer. Afterward, the children discussed what to do with him. Lily assumed he'd bother us after his brief jail stint, while Henry wanted to hire men to legally handle him. William suggested I move overseas with him, as he had an art exhibition and teaching position in New York. I smiled and shook my head. "There is no need. Years ago, he abandoned us to reunite with his true love and his secret son. Let's just send him back to them." Henry orchestrated it smoothly. When Thomas was released, he was offered a manual labor job in a remote area. He was transported for hours. When he finally arrived, Thomas found himself dropped in the desolate, ruined remnants of our old rural village. He rushed to the old garden shed, only to find the brick wall broken, and his gold coins long gone. Wandering the dirt roads, he was recognized by a local who led him to a dilapidated, crumbling shack. The door opened to reveal an aged white-haired Evelyn, and sitting in the dark corner was the severely disabled, twisted form of a middle-aged Tommy. Evelyn grabbed Thomas violently, shouting, "You scoundrel! I went to prison for you, my family is gone, and our son is ruined. Why didn't you come for us?" Thomas was utterly trapped. Henry had donated heavily to the village's schools and clinics, ensuring that the locals would eagerly keep a watchful eye on Thomas, keeping him in that rural area forever. In his past life, Evelyn had wept at his grave, wishing they could be together. Now, they had the rest of their miserable, agonizing lives to spend together in absolute squalor. Conscience Thomas never had one. Ruthlessness. I had learned it all from him. Not long after dealing with Thomas, I experienced a sudden dizzy spell one morning and collapsed. Mrs. Vance rushed me to the hospital, and within hours, all three of my children dropped their multi-million-dollar business tasks to stand terrified by my bedside. "Mom, are you okay? Mom, please don't leave us," they cried, looking just like the three helpless toddlers who had begged me to wake up decades ago. I smiled, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. "Will, I'm so proud you chose art and lived freely. Henry, I'm so proud you built an empire and supported our family. Lily, you proved your brilliance to the world. I am so incredibly proud of all of you." Mrs. Vance walked in holding my chart, rolling her eyes affectionately. "It is just minor hypoglycemia, folks. Her blood sugar dropped. Stop crying like it is a tragedy." The children let out a massive collective sigh of relief. William knelt by my bed, gently taking my hand. "Mom, it doesn't matter how successful we are, or what kind of beautiful poetry we turn our lives into. None of it matters unless you are here to share it with us."
That's all for today. I'm Lina. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing stories every week. Thanks for watching.